The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison's gavel echoed through the chamber. What started as a routine divorce hearing was about to become something extraordinary. Rebecca Martinez sat quietly at her table, enduring sneers and whispers from across the aisle, completely unaware that in just moments, everything would change. Her ex-husband's smug confidence was about to shatter, and the entire courtroom would witness a revelation that would leave everyone speechless. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Monroe County courthouse as Rebecca Martinez adjusted her simple navy blazer and checked her watch. 9:30 sharp. She'd arrived early, as she always did for important appointments, a habit ingrained from years of military precision that civilian life hadn't quite erased. The courthouse corridors buzzed with the usual Monday morning chaos: lawyers wheeling briefcases, clerks shuffling papers, and anxious faces waiting for their turns before various judges. Rebecca found a quiet bench outside courtroom 4B and sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, professional but modest, nothing that would draw attention or give her ex-husband's attorney any ammunition. Well, look what the cat dragged in. The familiar voice made Rebecca's stomach tighten. She looked up to see Marcus Thompson approaching with his attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Gerald Walsh who commanded $500 an hour and had a reputation for being ruthless in divorce proceedings. Marcus wore an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than Rebecca's monthly rent, his perfectly styled hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Hello, Marcus," Rebecca said quietly, not standing from the bench. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Still playing the quiet little mouse, I see. Good strategy, considering what you're about to lose there." He gestured toward the courtroom doors. "Hope you found yourself a nice little apartment somewhere cheap, because the house, the cars, the savings, it's all coming back to where it belongs." Gerald Walsh cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should focus on the proceedings ahead, Mr. Thompson." But Marcus was just getting started. "You know what the best part is, Rebecca? Everyone in that courtroom is going to see you for what you really are, a failed military washout who couldn't hack it in the real world. No career, no prospects, no future. Just a woman who thought she could ride my coattails and then bail when things got tough." Rebecca remained seated, her expression unchanged, though her hands had unconsciously pressed together more tightly. She'd learned long ago that engaging with Marcus when he was in this mood only made things worse. The months leading up to their separation had been filled with similar scenes, his voice rising, his words cutting deeper each time, while she maintained the composure that had served her well in far more challenging situations than a courthouse hallway. "Cat got your tongue?" Marcus continued, his voice growing louder. A few other people in the corridor had begun to notice the confrontation. "Or maybe you're finally realizing that your little sob story about finding yourself isn't going to work on Judge Harrison. He's a practical man who deals in facts, not fairy tales about women who think they can just walk away from their responsibilities." Rebecca's attorney, Sarah Chen, appeared at that moment, her briefcase in one hand and a coffee in the other. Sarah was young, perhaps 32, and worked for a small firm that specialized in family law. She wasn't flashy like Gerald Walsh, but she was thorough and had a genuine concern for her clients that Rebecca appreciated. "Good morning, Rebecca," Sarah said, her eyes quickly assessing the situation. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Walsh." She nodded. Professionally to the opposing party, Marcus turned his attention to the new arrival. "Ah, the bargain basement attorney arrives. Sarah, you might want to advise your client to be reasonable there. Judge Harrison doesn't suffer fools gladly, and I'd hate to see Rebecca embarrass herself more than necessary." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Rebecca caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "We're prepared for the hearing, Mr. Thompson. Perhaps we should all head inside." The courtroom was smaller than Rebecca had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly greenish tint. Judge Harrison's bench dominated the front of the room, an imposing presence even when empty. A few other cases were scheduled after theirs, and the gallery held a handful of people, some lawyers waiting for their turns, a court reporter setting up equipment, and what appeared to be a law student with a notebook. Rebecca took her seat at the plaintiff's table, Sarah beside her organizing files. Across the aisle, Marcus and Gerald Walsh arranged their considerably larger stack of documents. Marcus kept glancing over at Rebecca, occasionally whispering something to his attorney. That would make Walsh nod gravely or jot down a note. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison," the bailiff announced. Judge Harrison entered with the brisk efficiency of someone who had presided over thousands of similar proceedings. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing the standard black robe that gave him an air of absolute authority. He settled into his chair and opened the file before him. Good morning. We're here for Thompson vs. Martinez, case number DVR 2024-1847. Counsel, please state your appearances. Gerald Walsh stood first. Gerald Walsh representing the defendant, Marcus Thompson, Your Honor. Sarah Rose. Sarah Chin representing the plaintiff, Rebecca Martinez, Your Honor. Judge Harrison nodded and began reading from the file. This is a dissolution of marriage proceeding. I see we have issues regarding property division, spousal support, and... He paused, flipping through pages. No children involved. Mr. Walsh, I'll hear your opening statement. Gerald Walsh stood and buttoned his suit jacket, every movement calculated for maximum effect. Thank you, Your Honor. This case is quite straightforward. Mr. Thompson, a successful business owner and pillar of the community, married the plaintiff. In good faith. However, Mrs. Martinez abandoned the marriage after just 3 years, citing irreconcilable differences, a convenient excuse for someone who simply couldn't adapt to adult responsibilities. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm but kept her eyes focused on the table in front of her. Walsh continued, the evidence will show that Mr. Thompson provided generously for his wife, supported her through what she claimed was a difficult transition from military service, and offered her every opportunity to build a meaningful life. Instead, she chose to walk away, and now seeks to claim half of assets she had no role in building. We ask the court to recognize the reality of this situation and award Mr. Thompson the majority of the marital assets, while limiting any spousal support to a minimal amount for a brief period. Marcus nodded approvingly at his attorney's words, occasionally glancing at Rebecca with an expression that suggested he was already planning how to spend the money he expected to keep. Judge Harrison made a few notes. Miss Chen. Sarah stood, her voice steady and clear. Your Honor, this is indeed a straightforward case, but not for the reasons opposing counsel suggests. Mrs. Martinez entered this marriage in good faith and contributed significantly to the household and to Mr. Thompson's business success. The evidence will show that she handled all administrative aspects of his consulting firm, managed their household finances, and supported him through several difficult business periods, all while dealing with her own transition from military service. Rebecca watched Sarah present their case, grateful for the young attorney's professionalism and attention to detail. Furthermore, Sarah continued, the breakdown of this marriage was not due to Mrs. Martinez's inability to adapt, but rather due to Mr. Thompson's increasingly controlling and demeaning behavior. Mrs. Martinez seeks only what is fair under Illinois law, an equitable division of marital assets and reasonable temporary support while she rebuilds her career. Judge Harrison nodded. Mr. Walsh, call your first witness. The defendant calls Marcus Thompson to the stand. Marcus strode to the witness stand with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair and smiled at his attorney. Mr. Thompson, please tell the court about your marriage to the plaintiff. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a reasonable, almost sympathetic tone. Your Honor, I tried to make that marriage work. I really did. When I met Rebecca, she was struggling with her transition out of the military. She'd left under circumstances that were, well, let's just say less than ideal. I thought I could help her find her place in the civilian world. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she remained still. I provided her with a beautiful home, covered all her expenses, even brought her into my business to give her something productive to do. But she never seemed satisfied. She was always distant, always looking for something else, something more. Finally, she just announced one day that she was leaving. No real explanation, just that she needed to find herself. Marcus shook his head sadly. It was devastating, Your Honor. Here I'd invested 3 years of my life, my resources, my emotional energy, trying to help someone who ultimately didn't want to be helped. Gerald Walsh nodded sympathetically. And during the marriage, what was Mrs. Martinez's contribution to the household income? Minimal at best, Marcus replied. She did some basic administrative work for my consulting firm, but nothing that required special skills or training. Mostly filing, answering phones, scheduling appointments. The kind of work I could have hired a part-time secretary to do for a fraction of what it cost to support her. Rebecca felt Sarah's hand briefly touch her arm, a gentle reminder to stay calm. Mr. Thompson, in your opinion, what would be a fair resolution to this matter? Marcus straightened in his chair. Your Honor, I believe in being reasonable. I'm willing to give Rebecca a modest settlement, enough to help her get on her feet and find her own place. But the house, the business, the investments we made during the marriage, those came from my efforts, my connections, my expertise. It wouldn't be fair to penalize me for her decision to abandon our marriage. Walsh smiled. Thank you. No further questions. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Sarah stood for cross-examination. Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that Mrs. Martinez left the military under less than ideal circumstances. What specifically do you mean by that? Marcus shifted slightly in his seat. Well, she received some kind of medical discharge. The details were never entirely clear to me. She didn't like to talk about it. I see. And when you say she did basic administrative work for your business, are you referring to the work she did developing your client database, creating your appointment scheduling system, and managing your accounts receivable? Those were simple tasks that anyone could have done. Simple tasks that increased your client retention rate by 30% and reduced your overhead costs by nearly $20,000 annually? Gerald Walsh stood. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying. Sustained. Ms. Chen, please rephrase. Mr. Thompson, are you aware that the improvements Mrs. Martinez made to your business operations resulted in significant cost savings and increased revenue? Marcus's confident expression wavered slightly. She may have made some minor improvements, but the success of my business comes from my relationships with clients and my expertise in the field. Sarah consulted her notes. Speaking of your business expertise, isn't it true that you missed several important client meetings during the marriage due to what you described as personal issues, and that Mrs. Martinez handled those meetings in your absence? That happened maybe once or twice. According to your own business calendar, which Mrs. Martinez maintained, it happened 17 times over 2 years. And in each case, the clients specifically requested to continue working with her rather than rescheduling with you. Marcus's jaw tightened. That's not. I mean, clients sometimes develop preferences, but that doesn't mean. Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that 3 of your major clients specifically told you they were impressed with Mrs. Martinez's professionalism and attention to detail? I don't recall the specifics of every client conversation. Sarah moved closer to the witness stand. And isn't it also true that when Mrs. Martinez left, 2 of those clients terminated their contracts with your firm specifically because they had been working primarily with her? Gerald Walsh stood again. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? Judge Harrison looked at Sarah. Counselor. Your Honor, this goes directly to Mr. Thompson's claim that Mrs. Martinez contributed nothing of value to the marriage or to the business that constitutes a significant portion of the marital assets. I'll allow it. Mr. Thompson, please answer the question. Marcus was clearly uncomfortable now. Some clients may have been disappointed when Rebecca left, but that's just the nature of business. People come and go. People come and go, Sarah repeated. Is that how you viewed your marriage as well, Mr. Thompson? Of course not. Then why, according to the financial records, did you open a separate bank account in your name only just 2 months before Mrs. Martinez filed for divorce? The courtroom was completely silent. Marcus glanced at his attorney, who was frantically flipping through papers. That was for business purposes. Business purposes that required you to transfer $47,000 from your joint account without informing your wife? Marcus's face had grown red. I don't have to justify every business decision to someone who was planning to leave anyway. So you knew she was planning to leave? That's not what I meant. Sarah returned to her table. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Harrison made several notes before looking up. Mr. Walsh, any redirect? Gerald Walsh stood, clearly hoping to recover some ground. Mr. Thompson, regardless of any temporary business arrangements, isn't it true that the primary assets in this marriage came from your premarital business and your ongoing efforts to build that business? Absolutely, Your Honor. I built that company from nothing, starting years before I even met Rebecca. And the house you purchased during the marriage, was that financed primarily through your business income? Yes, it was. Thank you. Nothing further. As Marcus returned to his seat, he shot a look at Rebecca that was pure venom. She met his gaze steadily, her expression unchanged. Judge Harrison consulted his notes and looked at Sarah. Ms. Chen, call your first witness. The plaintiff calls Rebecca Martinez to the stand. Rebecca rose from her chair with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout Marcus's testimony. As she walked to the witness stand, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom following her. Marcus whispered something to his attorney, and she caught a glimpse of his smirk in her peripheral vision. After being sworn in, Rebecca settled into the witness chair. Her posture was straight but not rigid, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Sarah approached with a reassuring smile. Mrs. Martinez, please tell the court about your background before your marriage to Mr. Thompson. Rebecca's voice was clear and steady. I served in the United States Navy for 12 years, Your Honor. I was stationed primarily in San Diego and Norfolk, with deployments to the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. And what was your role in the Navy? I was a communications specialist, responsible for managing secure communication systems and coordinating information flow between naval units and command structures. Sarah nodded. Can you describe the circumstances that led to your discharge from the Navy? Rebecca paused for a moment, and for the first time since taking the stand, her composed expression showed a flicker of something deeper. I was injured during a training exercise in 2019. An equipment malfunction during a helicopter transfer resulted in a severe back injury that required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. And how did this injury affect your military career? After 18 months of medical treatment and physical therapy, the Navy Medical Board determined that I could no longer meet the physical requirements for active duty. I was medically retired with full honors. Gerald Walsh had been taking notes, but he looked up sharply at the phrase, full honors. Marcus's expression had also changed, the smirk fading slightly. Sarah continued, how did you meet Mr. Thompson? We met at a veterans support group meeting in Chicago. Marcus had attended as part of a community outreach program his consulting firm was involved in. He seemed very interested in military culture and made a point of speaking with several of the veterans after the meeting. And how would you describe the early period of your relationship? Rebecca considered the question carefully. Marcus was very attentive and supportive. He seemed to understand the challenges I was facing in transitioning to civilian life. He was particularly interested in my military experience and would often ask detailed questions about my service and the people I'd worked with. When did you marry? June 15, 2021. It was a small ceremony at the Chicago Botanical Garden. And after your marriage, what role did you play in Mr. Thompson's business? Rebecca straightened slightly. Initially, Marcus described it as helping out with small tasks, but it quickly became much more comprehensive. I redesigned his entire client management system, implemented new scheduling protocols, and took over the financial tracking for his accounts receivable. Can you be more specific about these contributions? When I started working with the business, Marcus was losing clients due to missed appointments and poor communication. He had no systematic way of tracking client preferences, project deadlines, or payment schedules. I created a comprehensive database that tracked every interaction with each client, their specific requirements, and their project timelines. Sarah moved closer to the witness stand. What was the result of these changes? Within 6 months, client retention improved dramatically. We also identified several clients who had been significantly undercharged for services, which increased revenue by approximately $35,000 in the first year alone. Gerald Walsh was scribbling notes furiously now, and Marcus had leaned forward to whisper urgently in his ear. Mrs. Martinez, Mr. Thompson testified that you performed basic administrative tasks that anyone could have done. How do you respond to that characterization? For the first time, Rebecca's voice carried a slight edge. The system I implemented required understanding both business operations and client relationship management. It also required the kind of attention to detail and systematic thinking that comes from years of managing complex logistical operations under pressure. You're referring to your military experience? Yes. In the Navy, a single communication error or missed detail could compromise an entire mission. I brought that same level of precision and reliability to Marcus's business. Sarah returned to her table and picked up a document. Mrs. Martinez, I'm showing you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 7. Can you identify this? Rebecca examined the paper. This is a letter from Peterson Industries, one of Marcus's largest clients. It's addressed to me personally, thanking me for my work on their quarterly compliance reports and requesting that I continue as their primary point of contact. And Plaintiff's Exhibit 8? This is a similar letter from Meridian Financial Services. They specifically mention my military precision and exceptional organizational skills. Sarah presented several more exhibits, letters, emails, and client feedback forms, all praising Rebecca's work and many requesting to work with her directly rather than with Marcus. Mrs. Martinez, during your marriage, how would you describe your relationship with Mr. Thompson? Rebecca's expression became more guarded. It changed significantly over time. Initially, Marcus seemed proud of my military background and the improvements I was making to his business. But as the business grew more successful, he began to take full credit for the changes and to minimize my contributions. Can you give the court a specific example? In late 2022, we attended a networking event where Marcus was speaking about business growth strategies. When someone in the audience asked about his improved client retention rates, he gave a presentation about innovative management techniques that were actually the systems I had implemented. When I tried to clarify my role later, he became very angry and accused me of trying to embarrass him in front of potential clients. How did Mr. Thompson's attitude toward you change over time? Rebecca took a deep breath. He became increasingly controlling and dismissive. He would criticize my work in front of clients, then privately ask me to fix problems he'd created. He started referring to my military service as playing soldier and suggested that I was lucky he'd given me a chance in the real world. Marcus was shaking his head vigorously, his face flushed with anger. Gerald Walsh placed a restraining hand on his client's arm. Mrs. Martinez, what led to your decision to file for divorce? The final incident occurred in March of this year. Marcus had a client presentation that he'd prepared poorly. The night before, he asked me to completely redo his materials. I worked until 3 in the morning to create new presentations, financial projections, and supporting documents. The presentation was a success, and the client signed a contract worth over $200,000. Rebecca's voice remained steady, but her hands had tightened slightly in her lap. That evening, Marcus took several potential clients to dinner and spent the entire meal talking about his brilliant presentation and his natural business instincts. When one of the clients asked about his team, he said he preferred to work alone and that he didn't believe in sharing credit for his ideas. How did that make you feel? It made me realize that no matter what I contributed to the marriage or the business, Marcus would never see me as an equal partner. I was simply a convenient resource that he could use and then dismiss when it suited him. Sarah nodded sympathetically. What are you seeking from this divorce? I want a fair division of the marital assets that I helped to build, and temporary support while I establish my own career. I'm not trying to take anything that isn't rightfully mine, but I also won't accept being dismissed as if my contributions meant nothing. Thank you, Mrs. Martinez. No further questions. Gerald Walsh stood for cross-examination, his expression suggesting he was confident about his line of attack. Mrs. Martinez, you mentioned that you were medically discharged from the Navy. Isn't it true that this discharge came after you failed to meet the physical requirements for your position? I was medically retired due to injuries sustained in the line of duty. But you were unable to continue serving, correct? Sarah stood. Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already answered that question. Sustained. Move on, Mr. Walsh. Walsh adjusted his approach. Mrs. Martinez, during your marriage, did you contribute any income from outside employment? No, I worked full-time for Marcus's business. Without a formal salary or employment contract. Marcus preferred to handle our finances jointly. He said it was more efficient for tax purposes. So you had no independent income and no formal work experience outside of the military? Rebecca's jaw tightened slightly. My work for the business was formal employment, even if the arrangement was informal. But you have no college degree, no business certification, no credentials that would qualify you for similar work elsewhere? I have 12 years of military experience managing complex operations and personnel. Walsh smiled coldly. Military experience that ended when you were unable to continue serving. Mrs. Martinez, isn't it true that you married my client because you needed financial security after your military career ended? That's absolutely false. And isn't it true that when you realized the business was becoming successful, you began planning to divorce my client so you could claim half of his assets? Rebecca's voice sharpened. I filed for divorce because my husband treated me like an employee he could use and discard, not because I wanted his money. But you are asking for half of the business assets and ongoing support, aren't you? I'm asking for a fair division of assets that I helped to create. Walsh moved closer to the witness stand. Mrs. Martinez, you claim to have improved my client's business, but isn't it true that the real growth came from Mr. Thompson's networking and his reputation in the industry? The networking was only effective because we had systems in place to follow through on commitments and maintain client relationships. Systems that any competent administrative assistant could have implemented? Rebecca straightened in her chair, and for the first time, there was a flash of something formidable in her expression. Mr. Walsh, I don't think you understand the complexity of what was required. Oh, I think I understand perfectly. You're trying to inflate your contributions to justify taking half of something you didn't build. Sarah was on her feet. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is arguing with the witness. Sustained. Mr. Walsh, ask questions, don't make speeches. But Walsh was pressing his advantage. Mrs. Martinez, the truth is that you were a failed military member who married my client for security, contributed minimal value to his business, and now want to be rewarded for abandoning the marriage, isn't that correct? The courtroom was dead silent. Rebecca stared at Walsh for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable authority. Mr. Walsh, I wasn't a failed military member. I served my country with distinction for 12 years, received multiple commendations for my service, and was medically retired after being injured in the line of duty. I didn't marry Marcus for security, I married him because I believed we could build a life together. And I didn't abandon our marriage, I left a situation where my contributions were dismissed. And my service to my country was mocked. The change in Rebecca's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. She sat straighter, her voice carried more weight, and there was something in her bearing that commanded attention. Even Judge Harrison seemed to be listening more intently. Walsh, however, was determined to press his attack. Your service, Mrs. Martinez, ended in medical discharge. Whatever you accomplished before that is irrelevant to this case. Rebecca's eyes never left Walsh's face. My service to my country is never irrelevant, counselor. There was something in her tone that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter. Marcus was frowning now, looking less confident than he had moments before. Walsh seemed to sense he might be losing ground, but he pushed forward. The point is, Mrs. Martinez, that your military career is over, and you're asking this court to reward you for work that any qualified person could have performed. Judge Harrison had been taking notes throughout the exchange, but he looked up sharply at this comment. Mr. Walsh, I think we've covered this ground sufficiently. Do you have any other questions for the witness? Gerald Walsh straightened his tie, clearly irritated by Judge Harrison's interruption but determined to finish his cross-examination. Actually, Your Honor, I do have a few more questions that go to the heart of this matter. Judge Harrison nodded curtly. Proceed, but keep it focused. Walsh turned back to Rebecca, his expression calculating. Mrs. Martinez, you've made much of your military service, but let's talk about the reality of your situation. When you left the Navy, you had no job prospects, no civilian work experience, and significant medical expenses, correct? I had challenges transitioning to civilian life, yes. And Mr. Thompson not only married you but also provided you with housing, healthcare, and employment when no one else would, isn't that true? Rebecca's composure remained intact, but there was steel in her voice. Marcus didn't rescue me, Mr. Walsh. We entered into a marriage as equal partners. Equal partners? Walsh laughed dismissively. Mrs. Martinez, you brought nothing to this marriage except medical bills and a disability pension. My client provided everything, the home, the income, the opportunity to contribute to his established business. Sarah started to object, but Rebecca spoke first, her voice cutting through the courtroom with unexpected authority. Mr. Walsh, I brought 12 years of experience managing multi-million-dollar operations, coordinating between senior military officials and civilian contractors, and handling classified communications that could affect national security. I brought leadership experience overseeing teams of 30 personnel, budget management skills handling accounts worth over $50 million annually, and the ability to make critical decisions under extreme pressure. The courtroom had grown completely silent. Even Marcus was staring at his ex-wife with an expression of surprise, as if hearing this information for the first time. Walsh, however, pressed on. Yet despite all these supposed qualifications, you were unable to maintain your military career. I was injured serving my country. And that injury made you unemployable in any comparable civilian position, didn't it? Rebecca's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Mr. Walsh, are you suggesting that wounded veterans are unemployable? Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his attention now completely focused on the exchange. Walsh realized he might have overstepped but continued his attack. I'm suggesting that whatever skills you claim to have had in the military, they didn't translate to any meaningful career prospects in the civilian world. You were completely dependent on my client's generosity. Your client's generosity? Rebecca's voice had dropped to a quiet intensity that somehow carried more weight than shouting. Let me tell you about generosity, counselor. Generosity is serving your country for 12 years, including 3 combat deployments. Generosity is working 18-hour days to save my husband's failing business while he took credit for my work. Generosity is maintaining my dignity while listening to him mock my service at dinner parties. Marcus was shifting uncomfortably in his chair, whispering urgently to Walsh, but his attorney was too focused on his attack to pay attention. Mrs. Martinez, you can dress up your story however you like, but the facts remain, the facts, Rebecca interrupted, her voice now carrying an unmistakable command presence. Are that I served with distinction in the United States Navy, earned the respect of my superiors and subordinates, and was medically retired with full honors after being wounded in service to my country. The facts are that I transformed my husband's business from a struggling consultancy into a thriving operation that doubled its revenue in 2 years. And the facts are that despite contributing significantly to our marriage both personally and professionally, I was treated as nothing more than unpaid labor. The change in Rebecca was remarkable. She sat straighter, her voice carried natural authority, and her bearing commanded attention. Several people in the gallery had unconsciously sat up straighter, responding to something in her presence. Walsh seemed to sense he was losing control of the cross-examination. Your Honor, I think the witness is being evasive. I'm being precise. Counselor, Rebecca said firmly. A skill I learned coordinating operations where precision meant the difference between mission success and putting people's lives at risk. Judge Harrison was watching the exchange with keen interest, making notes and occasionally glancing between Rebecca and the attorneys. Walsh decided to try a different approach. Mrs. Martinez, you mentioned combat deployments. Can you be specific about your role in these deployments? Sarah stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. The witness's specific military assignments may involve classified information. Your Honor, Walsh argued, the witness has made her military service a central part of her case. We should be able to examine the specifics. Judge Harrison considered this. I'll allow general questions about her service record, but nothing that might compromise security protocols. Mrs. Martinez, you may answer in general terms. Rebecca nodded. I served 3 deployments in support of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. My primary responsibility was maintaining secure communications between naval units and joint command structures, ensuring that critical information reached the appropriate decision-makers in real time. And what rank did you achieve? I was a senior chief petty officer when I was medically retired. Marcus's face had gone pale. He was staring at Rebecca as if seeing her for the first time, and he was whispering frantically to his attorney. Walsh glanced back at his client, clearly confused by Marcus's sudden agitation. Senior Chief Petty Officer, Walsh repeated. That sounds very impressive. What exactly does that mean in terms of actual responsibility? For the first time since taking the stand, Rebecca smiled slightly. It means I was responsible for the training, welfare, and performance of junior personnel. It means I served as a technical expert and advisor to commissioned officers. It means I was entrusted with ensuring that critical communication systems function flawlessly under combat conditions. I see. And after achieving this impressive rank, you were discharged due to your inability to meet physical requirements. I was medically retired after being injured during a helicopter training exercise. The injury occurred when I was being transferred between ships during a joint operation training scenario. Walsh sensed an opening. So despite all these qualifications you claim, you were ultimately unable to complete your military service? Rebecca's expression hardened. Mr. Walsh, I completed 12 years of honorable service to my country. I was injured while training to better serve that country. There is no shame in being wounded in service, and there is no failure in being medically retired with full honors. But you were forced to leave. I was medically retired, Rebecca repeated firmly, after an injury sustained in the line of duty. My service record speaks for itself. Judge Harrison had stopped taking notes and was now watching Rebecca intently. There was something in his expression that suggested recognition, though of what, no one in the courtroom could say. Walsh glanced back at Marcus again, who was now visibly agitated and making urgent gestures. Walsh looked confused but pressed on with his attack. Mrs. Martinez, regardless of your military record, the point remains that when you married my client, you were essentially unemployable and completely dependent on him for financial support. Rebecca's voice became very quiet, very controlled. Mr. Walsh, I have never been unemployable. I chose to work for my husband's business because I believed we were building something together. I contributed my skills, my experience, and my dedication to make that business successful. The fact that he chose to minimize those contributions doesn't diminish their value. Your contributions, Walsh said dismissively, amounted to basic administrative work that anyone with a high school education could have performed. The courtroom was completely silent. Rebecca stared at Walsh for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the room. Counselor, the basic administrative work you're referring to included coordinating with clients whose contracts were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, managing financial systems that required understanding of complex business regulations, and implementing organizational protocols that drew directly on my experience managing operations where mistakes could cost lives. If you think that's work anyone with a high school education could perform, then you fundamentally misunderstand both the complexity of effective business operations and the level of training required for military leadership positions. Marcus was now pulling on Walsh's sleeve, trying to get his attention, but Walsh was too focused on what he saw as his winning argument. Military leadership, Walsh repeated with a sneer. Mrs. Martinez, you keep returning to your military service as if it gives you some special status, but the reality is that your military career ended in failure. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud. Rebecca stared at Walsh with an expression that was calm but somehow formidable. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly controlled, but it carried an unmistakable edge of command. "Mr. Walsh, my military career did not end in failure. It ended when I was wounded serving my country. I served with honor, I led with distinction, and I earned the respect of everyone I served with, from junior enlisted personnel to flag officers." Judge Harrison was now leaning forward in his chair, his full attention on Rebecca. Something in her bearing, her choice of words, or her presence seemed to have captured his complete focus. Walsh, however, seemed oblivious to the change in the courtroom's atmosphere. "Flag officers, Mrs. Martinez? You're claiming you worked with admirals and generals?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "In my position, coordination with senior officers was a regular part of my duties." "How convenient," Walsh said with obvious skepticism. "And I suppose these flag officers would remember you fondly?" "I believe they would, yes." Marcus had given up trying to get his attorney's attention and was now slumped in his chair, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. He seemed to realize something that Walsh had completely missed. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Walsh, do you have any other questions for this witness?" Gerald Walsh was so focused on what he perceived as his winning strategy that he completely missed Judge Harrison's pointed question. Instead, he turned back to Rebecca with renewed confidence. "Actually, Your Honor, I do have more questions. Mrs. Martinez, you've painted quite an impressive picture of your military service. Tell me, what was your specific military occupational specialty?" "I was a cryptologic technician, specializing in communications intelligence and information warfare." Walsh waved dismissively. "That sounds very technical, but what did you actually do day to day?" Rebecca's voice remained steady, but there was an undercurrent of controlled intensity. "I managed secure communication networks, analyzed intelligence data, and coordinated information flow between multiple command levels. I also supervised training programs for junior technicians and served as a liaison between Navy units and joint service operations." "And you claim this somehow qualifies you to run a civilian consulting business?" "It qualifies me to manage complex operations, handle sensitive information, and coordinate between multiple stakeholders under pressure, all of which were essential to improving Marcus's business." Walsh smirked. "Mrs. Martinez, you can use all the military jargon you want, but the bottom line is that you were essentially a communications clerk who got hurt and couldn't continue working." The insult hung in the air. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that seemed to add inches to her height even while seated. "Mr. Walsh, I was not a communications clerk. I was a senior chief petty officer with 12 years of distinguished service, including multiple deployments in combat zones where my work directly supported ongoing military operations." Marcus was now frantically trying to catch his attorney's attention, making cutting gestures across his throat and mouthing "stop," but Walsh was completely absorbed in his attack. "Distinguished service that ended when you couldn't meet basic physical requirements," Walsh pressed. "Let's be honest about what happened, Mrs. Martinez. You washed out of the military and needed my client to support you." Judge Harrison's pen had stopped moving entirely. He was staring at Rebecca with an expression of growing recognition, his eyes narrowing as if trying to recall something important. Rebecca's voice, when she responded, carried a quiet authority that seemed to resonate through the courtroom. "Mr. Walsh, I did not wash out of anything. I was wounded during a joint training exercise while being transferred between naval vessels. The injury to my spine required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. After 18 months of medical treatment, a Navy medical board determined that I could no longer meet the physical demands of active duty, and I was medically retired with full honors and a commendation for my service record." "Full honors," Walsh repeated mockingly. "How impressive. And what exactly were you being honored for? Filing paperwork?" The question seemed to electrify the courtroom. Rebecca sat perfectly still for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried an unmistakable note of command. "I was honored for my service during Operation Enduring Freedom, where I coordinated communications support for special operations units conducting high-priority missions. I was honored for developing new protocols that improved intelligence sharing between Navy and Marine Corps units during Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was honored for training over 200 junior personnel during my career, many of whom went on to leadership positions themselves." Marcus had his head in his hands now, clearly realizing that his attorney was walking into a disaster, but Walsh seemed oblivious to everything except his perceived advantage. "Special operations, intelligence sharing, you certainly have an impressive collection of claims, Mrs. Martinez. I suppose you'll tell us next that you work directly with Navy SEALs or Marine Force Recon. Rebecca looked at him steadily. As a matter of fact, I did coordinate communications support for both SEAL teams and Marine Special Operations units during my deployments. Judge Harrison suddenly sat up straighter in his chair. He was staring at Rebecca with an expression of dawning recognition, his eyes widening slightly. Walsh, however, was too deep into his attack to notice the judge's reaction. Of course you did. And I suppose you received medals and commendations for all this heroic service? I received the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, the Joint Service Achievement Medal, and the Combat Action Ribbon, among others. How convenient. And I suppose you have documentation of all these impressive accomplishments? Sarah started to stand, but Rebecca raised her hand slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and reassurance. Mr. Walsh, my service record is a matter of official military documentation. Every commendation, every assignment, every evaluation is recorded in my personnel file. Walsh sensed what he thought was an opening. Personnel files that are conveniently classified and unavailable for verification, no doubt. My basic service record is not classified, counselor. My specific operational assignments may be, but my rank, length of service, and major commendations are matters of public record. Judge Harrison was now leaning forward in his chair, his complete attention focused on Rebecca. Something in her bearing, her precise military terminology, or her calm authority under attack seemed to have triggered a memory. Walsh pressed his advantage. Mrs. Martinez, the truth is that you're inflating a basic military job to make yourself sound more impressive than you actually are. You were a low-level communications worker who got injured and discharged. Rebecca's eyes flashed with controlled anger. Mr. Walsh, I was a senior chief petty officer, the equivalent of a sergeant major in the Army or Marine Corps. I was responsible for the training and supervision of enlisted personnel. I served as a technical advisor to commissioned officers. And I held a top-secret security clearance with special compartmented information access. The military precision of her language and the quiet authority in her voice seemed to fill the courtroom. Judge Harrison was now staring at her with obvious recognition, though he remained silent. Marcus finally succeeded in grabbing Walsh's arm, pulling him back toward the table and whispering urgently in his ear. But Walsh shook him off, determined to press what he saw as his winning attack. Top secret clearance, special access, very impressive sounding, Mrs. Martinez. But none of that changes the fact that you were ultimately discharged for being unfit for duty. I was medically retired for injuries sustained in the line of duty, Rebecca corrected firmly. There is a significant difference. A difference that ultimately amounts to the same thing: you couldn't continue serving. Rebecca's composure finally showed a crack, and her voice carried an edge of steel. Mr. Walsh, I could not continue serving because I was wounded while training to better serve my country. I did not fail at anything. I was injured performing my duties, and I was retired with honor and recognition for 12 years of distinguished service. Judge Harrison cleared his throat loudly, and everyone in the courtroom turned to look at him. His expression was serious, and he was studying Rebecca with intense focus. Mr. Walsh, Judge Harrison said slowly, what ship was Mrs. Martinez serving on when she was injured? Walsh looked confused by the unexpected question from the bench. He glanced at his notes, then back at the judge. I don't believe that information is in evidence, Your Honor. Judge Harrison looked directly at Rebecca. Mrs. Martinez, can you answer that question? Rebecca met the judge's gaze steadily. I was participating in a joint training exercise involving the USS Nimitz and several supporting vessels, Your Honor. The injury occurred during a helicopter transfer between ships. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, his expression showing clear recognition now. And what year was this? 2019, Your Honor. The judge made a note, then looked back up at Rebecca with what appeared to be growing respect. Mrs. Martinez, during your service, did you ever coordinate communications for joint operations involving multiple service branches? Sarah looked confused by the judge's line of questioning, but she remained silent. Yes, Your Honor. Joint operations were a significant part of my responsibilities during my later deployments. And in these joint operations, did you ever work directly with flag officers from different service branches? Rebecca straightened slightly. Yes, Your Honor. Coordinating communications between different service branches often required direct interaction with senior officers to ensure proper information flow and operational security. Judge Harrison was now studying Rebecca with obvious interest, and his next question surprised everyone in the courtroom. Mrs. Martinez, what was your full military rank and designation when you were medically retired? Rebecca's answer was precise and formal. Senior Chief Petty Officer, Cryptologic Technician, United States Navy, Your Honor. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since the hearing began, he smiled slightly. Senior Chief Martinez, he said, using her military rank and giving the words particular weight, thank you for clarifying your background. The use of her military rank seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. Marcus looked as if he was about to be sick, several people in the gallery were staring at Rebecca with new understanding, and Walsh finally seemed to realize that something significant had just occurred, but he was too committed to his strategy to back down now. Your Honor, I don't see how these military details are relevant to the divorce proceedings. Judge Harrison looked at Walsh with an expression that suggested the attorney had just made a serious error in judgment. Mr. Walsh, are you quite certain you want to continue this line of questioning? Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.